Tell me when I should start streaming, and I shall start streaming.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay.
I need to get in front of the light. There you go.
You might want to ask the students if they are they can like hear you, see you, everything, and it is live. So yeah. By the way, it is live right now.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Can you, if you can hear me and see all the fun stuff, maybe say yes in the chat. I can't see the chat, Ishan, so you'll have to.
Yeah, I'll tell you.
Great.
And then we can start. We are live. Just gonna wait for someone to write something on the chat.
Maybe they're not interested and they didn't log in.
2 people said yes.
All right, cool.
Okay,
all right, welcome
awesome.
everybody. Welcome to the final event of the first part of the studio, the Foundation Studio. We're joined by Anya Sirota and McLean Clutter. Familiar faces, there'll be familiar busts tonight in the Zoom space. But we wanted to bring everyone together to look at the efforts of yours for the first part of the studio. So more kind of set up for Anya and McLean. Basically, the studio is run in 2 parts. The first parts were a series of week-and-a-half-long design exercises where the students were asked to do quick software-based exercises, prescriptive in nature, things you will all have, things that will be familiar to you based on your familiarity with the studio and the 3G sequence. So we're going to focus on the last assignment for the majority of the evening, but this first part is just showing you the first 3 assignments, which will be at the end of this white shoebox of a space that Ishan will take us to in a second. So I guess like rooms are a theme of the night. So we asked the students for the first assignment to measure the room, essentially their bedroom or a room where they're staying, and then draw plans and then abstract that room into a series of grids and think about different ways that they could kind of animate those grids or overlay different grids on top of that. Everything is landing in a cargo site, so the output is always an animated GIF. So like in years past, I think media is a heavy part of the 3G sequence, and definitely in this studio and in the output of all of these, that it sort of everything ends in an animation essentially. So what we're seeing here are just screenshots of different, not quite the GIFs, but I guess more of the kind of key image of different studies. But start in your room, acknowledge the physical space around you, measure, abstract it, and then start working with it as geometry that you sort of like move around in software space and then output through an animation. So we can go to the next one. So the second assignment starts in Illustrator. So we're trying to get the students to think critically about which software does what. So the first one essentially starts in Rhino, goes through Illustrator to make drawings, and then eventually out of Photoshop as an animated GIF. So for this assignment, we asked them to start in Illustrator to draw 3 lines in Illustrator and then begin to exaggerate the thickness and the different qualities that Illustrator allows you to manipulate. This is like assignment 3. This is assignment 2. So it's basically 3 lines and they start to exaggerate their, like a ridiculously wide dashed line, play around with different end types in Illustrator, and then they take it into Rhino and then start to position them, orient them, extrude them, give them three-dimensional characteristics. So these like Illustrator lines essentially like turn into a proto-architectural structure. These more imageable ones are actually of the next assignment, which I'll talk about in a second. But it's like instead of Illustrator being output, it becomes a generative software, and they're like exaggerating the qualities and then using that to generate sort of form and space, let's say. Okay, we can go to the next assignment. So assignment 3 then starts in Photoshop, and they start by just composing a square texture map. So working first and foremost in Photoshop with gradients, with color, saturation, pattern, the kind of layer options of creating depth and glow and all these tricks that Photoshop has to produce sort of visual depth without physical depth. So they start by designing these square compositions that get mapped to like two sides of a cube. And then they start to fill in the other sides of the cube and then start this kind of cyclical workflow where they go between a mapped cube in Rhino and Photoshop, and essentially are trying to like work with 2D and 3D information simultaneously. Yeah, in a similar way in which assignment 2 like kind of flips the typical sequence of software. This does it again, and Photoshop becomes the generator of visual and spatial qualities. This then ends, I think we're seeing mostly the cube format of this, but there is another step to this where essentially this cube gets turned into an environment map. So you're inside of it in Rhino, and they added a few more additional elements. And like these cubes become an immersive interior that is the kind of step on the way to assignment 4, which we'll look at in a second. So we can go ahead to assignment 4. So this is assignment 4. So essentially they take that cube and they stretch it out. So it's like a 10 by 10 cube. All the while we're working like with grids and like the kind of dimensional constraints that move from like pixel grids in Photoshop to the dimensions of an artboard and Illustrator, and then the dimensions and ways of controlling dimensions in Rhino in Photoshop. So once they begin with that texture mapped cube, and then they stretch it out and then turn it into a series of interior surfaces, taking cues from the texture map more than function, but they begin to suggest function through the addition of entourage. So they're adding artifacts of life without scale figures. So this is a step where we're meant to suggest how these things might begin to be occupied without like being super explicit about how that happens. So we're gonna watch this once through. I think it's about 10 minutes long. So just what you're looking at is there's 33 students in the cohort. Each student did a 10-foot by 40-foot cube. They're spaced 5 feet apart, and they're all in a line. So we're gonna look at an animation which runs through all 33 cubes, one single shot, all in a kind of linear, like fixed in the middle of the space. So yeah, let's go ahead and watch it, Ishan. So I think Lida, Jacob, and I were going to do a little bit of a running commentary. So yeah, Jacob and Lida.
Will we appear on the screen? Oh no, will we appear on the screen?
We are there.
Okay. Oh, sorry, I should be more sorted. Yeah, so for this first section, we thought it made sense to just kind of like run through, just so you can sort of experience the first person slow roll through the entire thing and get a handle on it before we move more slowly through and kind of talk about each one and the elements of each one. So it'll move slower the second time through. But we figured it would be worth just kind of talking about the way we're presenting the work also, because we find it compelling and quite nice, actually.
Yeah, there was like there's an additional, so like if exercise 3 was about an immersion that was kind of like complete within a singular project, in the sequencing of these projects, kind of like daisy chaining them, what I find interesting is that many of the other elements, like expectations of timing and what you might do in this environment, are in their size are kind of like held as equal, so that you can actually focus on what's quite different about each one of the designs. So they kind of get to be really unique, even within this kind of like steady pace and singular experience within them. I think the ideas of their compositions and choices that they've made about how to minimally activate this environment through color, texture, and entourage, like really come to the foreground for each one of the projects.
It looks amazing on Twitch right now. Or I'm just watching it on my iPad through Twitch, which is far less grainy than what we're seeing in the Zoom space, but it looks pretty incredible.
Yeah. Sorry to break character, but I'm going to put that in the chat for McLean in case he wants to see it, and Anya. I mean, like, the other thing about these is that Adam may have said this, but like the idea is that it's moving closer and closer toward an actual occupiable architecture, starting from like we're like inching the students like slowly toward a kind of occupiable space, and we do that through like the hint of occupation and like entourage. So like pillows and things, but very explicitly prohibiting or putting a moratorium on like human scale figures, to still maintain like suspend disbelief a bit, and also not fall too deep into like preconceived notions of what a certain thing ought to be or how it should behave. It's like a piece of furniture or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would also say like maybe to kind of start seasoning questions or prompts to Anya, McLean, who drum set. I think that the 3G sequence, as you guys know well, is a funny one because we're both teaching. We're trying to like teach basic conventions, but like almost at the same time, or even before that, sometimes we're trying to teach how to like break convention. So like how to come at architectural design, like before they even understand necessarily what architectural design is, we're trying to get them to come at it in a way that's non-standard. So, thinking about Photoshop before you think about form and space, or again, the way that we were having them play with Illustrator. So, I think that's one thing that maybe we've talked about a little bit, but I think the students might, can always kind of use more clarification on. I think, overall, the importance of like media, I think like many in this Zoom filled time, we're trying to think about the nature of our interactions with one another, the kind of medium through which we're teaching and thinking and interacting socially with one another, and then also trying to foreground that, that's something that this 3G sequence has done consistently for years, but I think it has a kind of new charge and new extremity, really, like the saturation of media that we're all a part of. And we're definitely, I think, trying to foreground that even more and think about modes of conception, modes of dissemination, modes of experience sort of simultaneously.
I think also like it's an interesting sort of redefinition of what foundational means. Like I think like if kind of before we've set out like foundation is something that that has been sort of pre-validated, and then we consider our job to try to undo that in order to get at kind of like interesting things, like in some way that sets out always a dynamic, a tit for tat between the kind of like it always sets like other work in opposition to what's considered like foundational work. So I like the idea of setting out just redefining what is foundation. Like a lot of my students and I, like for this next project, we've been discussing like once you manifest program as a block of square feet, it seems like we can never undo that in a way. Like once we imagine like a room as a room, or like a kitchen as a sink, like it can't be undone as easily. It takes like a whole degree to undo that, whereas to start from this as a space in which you could lay, or this as a space in which you could cook, just seems like actually a more foundational way of thinking if you actually come to think about it. This is a language that can be relatable to everybody, that you don't need to be trained in to understand. Yeah, kitchen as disciplinary. Like kitchen is defined by the discipline.
Mm-hmm.
I ask just a clarification question, because things make more sense now that we like actually see the work.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain just one more time the step? I understand the step where you made the kind of Photoshop native raster image and played with like 2D, 3D relationships by mapping that thing onto the cube. And then what was the translation between that and this? Is this occupying the inside in some way?
So there's a step that we didn't get good examples of in the kind of preamble, the white rooms, but basically the cube that they texture mapped, they turn that into an environment map. So essentially you can take a cube and like get inside of it in Rhino. So it becomes a 360-degree background to Rhino, like an environment map. So when you tumble around the inside of the cube, all you see is the sort of like interior imagery of the cube. So what's nice about it is that it like takes, it takes like the kind of objectness of the cube and like flips that inside out. And so you're all of a sudden inside it, and you it becomes like the extent of your visual field. So they started to like add elements, like just simple kind of like surfaces or objects inside of that, and then they produced these like kind of tumbly like animations where they were just like moving their camera manually and exporting individual frames. So they just become like a kind of like intense visual field, 360 degrees visual field. Less kind of controlled, more immersive. And that's the step right before this one. So, you know, there's a lot of constraints throughout. It's like, you know, assignment 2 is like, you get 3 lines, you know, we're trying to set limits on like how much variation they can produce. And then once they get to this step in the or for this assignment, we just like the kind of training wheels are off, and we're just asking them to kind of like interpret their textures as a series of 3-dimensional surfaces and just kind of like run with it. And that's a lot of, I think, what you get in terms of yeah, it's kind of what you're seeing in the exuberance of these, I think, is the students really having fun.
Could I ask also one establishing question? Is it okay?
Please do.
Yeah, I was just wondering, also it's a foundational question about this kind of lovely slow roll aesthetic colonoscopy. And is this like an intentional anti-authorial pleasure? Like, are we deconstructing the heroics of the author, which is typically what we associate with foundational studio, where we learn how to be heroicist authors, how we talk about our intentionality, how we render iteration a crucial and important process. And then we talk ad nauseum about the things that we've done and the processes that we went through as though they're truly original. And this presentation is very unusual for a foundational studio in that sense, where it's the pleasure of the sequence out of any kind of normative sequence that you're inviting us to participate in. I was just wondering from the studio perspective if this is part of the intention.
I think yes, it is. I mean, so there's been like 2 key components to the studio thus far. These intermittent, like week and a half long design exercises, and then at the end of each one, we do like 5 days of reading and discussion. And those reading and discussion, the readings themselves and the discussions we've had around them have been, they started with a kind of some texts about architectural education in 1968. So comparing this moment to that moment, texts that were trying to demystify a little bit of that sort of genius notion in architecture, like being critical of that. And then we did this kind of longer arc view of the grid as it's been deployed as basically a mechanism of power to turn land into commodity, as a kind of colonial, sort of a technique of like colonial power. So we've studied the grid in a kind of like South American colonial context and in the US colonial context, and basically kind of use the grid and try to think about it, like go in and out almost in a kind of schizophrenic way, like the grid as the like regulating mechanism to place pixels in Photoshop, and then the grid as a sort of like tool of colonial power. And we sort of ended with some texts around sort of care, like critical care, and thinking about like moving away from a notion of like the built environment and land as like property, and one towards like the built environment supporting relations and community building and relations of care. What they're doing right now, or what they're starting right now, is it's like a co-living, co-learning space. It's a temporary Zoom school set 3 years in the future, where we're imagining the best parts of what we're experiencing now, supplemented with a mission to increase access, bring more people into kind of learning communities. So the kind of like political, social, critical bite has been a parallel track, which is now just emerging, or now the students have an opportunity to kind of pursue with more sort of effort in the more kind of broad way. And this has been you know, thematically related in terms of like the grid and how we think about design and kind of, I guess, like control or organization. But it's the sort of like tools that we want them to approach this project, which has a kind of programmatic ambition that I think is the response to the moment, trying to set these guys up to kind of go through their architectural and design careers with a kind of activist spirit. So sorry, it's a long question, but it's like, it sort of like runs a little bit parallel, I would say.
I mean, there's a lot of things that I find super interesting here. Sorry, not to be pedantic, but one more just like process question for clarification. So in the beginning, the very first thing they did was to work from their room. Is that right? Or a room?
The room that they were physically sitting in.
They were physically. So I think like towards like Anya's questions too about, I don't know, upending authorship. I don't know, like turning over the disciplines, paternalism, like all of these different things. I think there are a couple of interesting things in a foundation studio that are happening here. And I think it's really interesting that for me, at least the sequence of exercises you guys have done have gone from one pole to another. So like nobody here, at least as far as I know, nobody looked at like Maison Domino or Villa Rotunda or like any kind of authorized piece of precedent, which I think just immediately is really interesting. Instead, you turn towards something that is just found, like a space, the room you're in, an unremarkable, probably unauthored or unhigh authored, right? Like piece of architecture. And I think that's really interesting in a foundational studio as a turn towards like social realism, or you know, something that moves in a tendency towards what could be critical contextualism, or again, like the supposition that there's architecture all around us. We already all know something about architecture, and there's something to be learned by looking carefully at the room you're in. That this is like in a way, not a carefully guarded discipline, but part of it is common knowledge that we all just need to be aware of, and that what we do in a foundational studio is to build that awareness, which might be nascent already. Interesting to me that that's like on one pole. And then you go through all of these transformations, and by the time you get to the end, you're in another room, a new room, but it is moved, in my mind, through like the, through the window of extreme abstraction, away from any kind of realism, and fully embraced the kind of world making that abstraction can open us up to. And it's that kind of abstraction that I think Lida is talking about. Like once the sink is a sink, you can't unlearn the sink, or once a program is a program, you can't unlearn the program. But if you abstract it, if you turn it over, if you create, like you guys have done, like the studio has done, if you create rooms that have an internal consistency around logics that are invented, it starts to, in my mind at least, it starts to do this world making thing. It remakes convention anew and starts to open up directions out. But I don't know, for me, that's fascinating, because I also think that those are like both super compelling and great things to have in a foundational studio, but also, again, they like run the gambit from like architecture is something that's all around us to architecture is something that can reinvent what is all around us in the course of these sequences. So I think that's like, for me, wildly interesting that can happen. And in this short of a sequence. I don't know, I have more to say, but maybe I'll shut up for a second there and see if Anya wants to make sense of that.
No, I'm into what you're saying. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I mean, what I was, I still, it's been what, like 15 years since I took a foundational studio, and I'm still traumatized, like frankly, by the memory of being whipped into submission through a series of operations. And I'm watching this experience that y'all have choreographed as a collective, and it seems like the operations are a series of aesthetic intuitions that draw from things other than architecture, but sort of dabble in issues of taste and composition. And I can't quite track where the relation is to from the cube to the thing that I'm experiencing inside. And I'm enjoying that. And it's like I almost feel guilty for enjoying it, because I can't I can't as a critic point directly to the processes that led to these outcomes. And yet that seems very appropriate in the kind of in the forgetting of the patriarchal norms of this discipline through some sort of discovery process that is simultaneously individuated and collective. So I'm super stoked by just experiencing this as an infinite play of parts, where I can no longer track or trace the way and the systems that led to it. And so I feel kind of liberated, frankly, from that vantage point.
I mean, those
Do you
things
feel
happen.
liberated?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean,
things
those
happen, yeah.
those like whipping into shape things happened. I think sort of like, obviously there was like a process of iteration and review, but it like, I guess we are very intentionally like not showing that stuff to
Right.
like, I think that like like down with the patriarchy thing is more like moving through in first person view, not seeing any isometrics or plans or diagrams, and just, yeah, like forcing you to think about like, or speak, or us to talk about like affect, and like experience as a person moving through the space, which I think is also like provocative in a studio like this one, where typically you'd be asked to, like be following rules, and be accountable for them, which is true, but I guess you're not getting that piece of the puzzle. Anyway, I was doing the whipping, and not whipping into shape, but like the kind of making sure that clarity was a thing in the description. But maybe it's not evident, or it just doesn't matter in this context.
Or maybe what Anya is saying is that it's good that it's not evident. So,
well,
sorry,
it's been
Anya,
curated to be presenting. No, I agree with you. Like, it's been curated to be presented without evidence. So this is how you as instructors, you're asking us to read this.
Yeah.
Right, without evidence. That's right.
But I think also, like, in absence of the evidence of the process and protocols, it opens up the audience as well of this work, right? Like, you don't need to understand ISO, what it does, how to read it, in order to be able to discuss this work. So I think in that way, it's really, I think maybe that's my argument about it's a new foundation, right? Like, foundation as a less of a where clear communication or like wide communication can actually be a foundational skill. Appeal, affect, approach, having an in, like, having a feeling about it, I think in some way can be foundational in this case.
I mean, partly I want to like reveal our hand a bit, because so the grid as I think what you were saying a minute ago, McLean, is right. There is a certain acknowledgement. So again, just like the grid was a kind of like theme that allowed us to think about like political, social, geographic, governmental issues. But it was also a way to acknowledge, like we didn't have them read like Jesse Le Cavalier's work on Walmart, but that would be an example of like the grid out in the world, like reconfiguring vast quantities of the built environment far more than any architect who's theorized the grid from a kind of disciplinary mindset. And just to say we need to see these sort of like techniques of space making and organizational thinking and organizing the built environment in a broader context, because that's where I think the societal sort of like effects and structures that we're trying to interrogate right now, that's where they played out, not in necessarily the discipline of architecture as it was taught in a canonical studio 15 years ago. That said, I think we did so we started with like 68 as a moment, and we looked at Education of an Architect, the Cooper Union book, and both at like what they were doing, but also trying to like contextualize that within the moment of 68, which is crazy that I never thought of it historically in that way. It comes like after the world falling apart, and many people at that school thought it would be a good idea to just like completely turn away from society and to just think about like sort of grids and columns and shifts and shears in a kind of abstract sense. And I think, at best what we were trying to do is, and there's like a decent amount of like Francis Ching, like a lot of Francis Ching diagrams in the lectures, like leading into these assignments, it's just like, this is space making. This is how you like make a hole in a thing that gets you from one space to another. And so I think part of what we were trying to do is like put those techniques back in play, or those kind of foundational ways of thinking about space making, but quickly move them out of any kind of realm of sort of preciousness or patriarchal kind of like lineage clout, and into more, I don't know, sort of playful, fast and loose like ways of thinking about sort of design of like spatial and visual information, let's say. I don't know. I say that I don't know if like how much those like more foundational kind of diagrams and texts and understandings played into the students' work. Like I don't have an intimate enough awareness of their experience throughout this process to see if those played in, or if there's something else sort of happening here. But I think part of what we were trying to do is just like look to that stuff a little bit, but like pull away the techniques away from those authors and sort of put it in play in a new way.
Yeah, but I imagine, I don't know, it is a little discombobulating to watch them and thrilling also, but discombobulating to watch them in the way it's set up here. But I would imagine that like you guys got inside this cube and you made like, there are moves, right? There are like organizational and formal moves that are cued by what they're seeing as their background, right? As the kind of Rhino background.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I have like, like a combination of thoughts about that. Like one thing is that I just think that that's good to do, and also like just very different than the project that would be about like, let's just make some rooms that have a certain kind of affective quality, or a room that is a kind of scenography that is like super, like immediately super audience friendly. Like it's still a different exercise that's based on principles of abstraction, which I like will come out as like still thinking is one of that was like kind of what I was getting at in the beginning, like one of our good things. I still think abstraction is good. I think abstraction is good because it will help you to understand that the world we live in is filled with abstractions. So it's absolutely, I think, a fundamental thing. But yeah, I do think it's like really different than an exercise that is purely about like affect or vibe or tone. It's just a little bit of a different mindset. So that makes the slow roll interesting and also discombobulating, because we're going through a series of different rooms that have like they're internally coherent, or if they're like like the really good ones are, right? Like they probably have an internal coherence between their kinds of rule sets, but then we're like jump cutting from one rule set to another rule set. So from like one world to another world to another world. So they're like, I don't know. I think it's like both interesting and again, like discombobulating. They made me kind of lose my train of thought there.
And your dog's
It's
barking.
discombobulating. It's discombobulating in so many different ways. Like I'm just trying to get a grip, and the more I think that I understand what's happening, the more I lose it. So one thing that's super perplexing is that the exercise took you in some way from 2D to a 3-dimensional space that's sophisticated, that's about composition, that has its own interiorized rule set that's not being revealed, but is clearly there because some of these are super hot. So, you know, they've been thoughtful and they've been worked on diligently. But then it's represented once again through a traveling single point perspective that flattens the spatial experience of it and renders it once more playfully 2-dimensional, which is super weird. And I can't help but think about, you know, like, how are these curated? Who got to sit next to whom in this trajectory? Did everyone need to have an access hole on, you know, axially positioned so that you could move on to the next spatial configuration? It's just extraordinary, the play between the 2D, the 3D, and a kind of pop trivia that seems to be manifesting itself, where you can't help but question the source material of what's happening to the visual experience. Are you getting a grip, McLean?
I'm getting a grip. I like this. If it's not clear, I like this. I like this project.
Yeah, me too.
And I'm having a good time, like thinking about it and talking about it. And so, like, not to make this well, I'm not a historian, so it can't be a history lesson anyway. But like the difference between, there's a big difference, I think, between like what Cooper was doing in '68 and now, which is that, and I don't know, I think it's valuable context for this. Is like, yeah, the world was melting down in '68, and you know, that school had to decide what they thought was the path forward. But they were also like right on the heels of what was perceived to be the failures of the modernist project, which was like, you know, meant to fully recreate the world and recreate the world order. You know, we are like nowhere near to that, to a memory of that kind of engagement of architecture in society. So I think it makes it a little bit, it changes the stakes. And so if I want to be generous to that moment, I think like, oh, well, like a turn inward to think that we might discover something that can remake the world through kind of internal conventions maybe makes sense. But yeah, I think we're at a very different moment. And then like another thing that makes me think about this assignment particularly, that is prompted by thinking back at that work, the Cooper work, and the whole formalist lineage that is a part of, the whole Colin Rowe, Hedek, Eisenman, all of those white dudes. Like one thing that's really interesting if you go back and look at that is that the axon as the formative representation for the development of that kind of thought, there were a number of reasons for it, but among the reasons were a kind of critique of ocular centrism and the idealized subjectivities that are implicated by one point perspective. The idea that we can't understand the way everyone sees, and that there's a kind of hegemony in that kind of representation. So I don't know, it's interesting that here we are back, like now we're critiquing the I think very, very rightfully, critiquing the elitism, pervasive whiteness, pervasive maleness of that formalist lineage. But we're like in a slow roll 1 point perspective through a series of different rooms. I don't know what to make of that.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder about where it ends. Like, this is, like, this is, I guess I'm wondering about the degree to which this kind of work or this assignment or whatever, this sort of exercise and design thinking, visual imagination, like, um, the degree to which it has like value on its own versus it being a sort of like set of tools that co-emerge with a kind of social and political project that is sort of conceived of, yeah, in concert with. I don't know, like I think about Anya's work, like is very inspirational to me along these lines, which is like giving you would, and I've heard you phrase it a million times better than I will right now, but like giving a kind of like social and political like project and aesthetic, like giving it life through design. And not to say that one is like like they kind of co-emerge in this incredibly profound way. And I don't know, like that's in the back of my mind is like sort of a goal for these students would be to sort of put these tools into context in which, yeah, they're sort of like aspirations for the way they want to sort of better the world, can have a kind of design exuberance, a life of like fun to it that, yeah, just does different kinds of work. So this is a kind of like step in like in a kind of set of aspirations that doesn't end here, is one of the things that I'm kind of like thinking about, in the context, but also in the context of like a curriculum or a pedagogy. Like, how do you, like, what does it mean to start here? Like, what does it mean to separate the two? Or just like, what is that? Yeah. How do you frame it? How do you sort of like build up these two capacities to think critically about the world, but also to like be able to create things like this and set these students up to kind of, yeah, have an impact.
I also, yeah, it's super interesting. I also wonder what would happen if they had to like trade or share, um, other things like that would even more like help to, um, I don't know, eschew notions of individual authorship or, yeah, because that's like, I'm super into the single rooms that I keep on wanting to read as world making exercises.
Mm-hmm.
But like, I guess the only side effect, or not the only, the biggest side effect that I can think of that maybe we wouldn't want to defend is that it does hold up like the idea in a way of individual authorship or even of like extreme association of the individual with these rooms, these like aesthetic worlds that they've created. Like, I wonder what would happen if they had to like trade midway or use one another's source material as kind of found material, just to like further erode the idea of authorship.
Funny you should mention that, because for their final, yeah, so they're working in groups of 5 to 6, and now working to develop co-working, co-working, like Adam described in the beginning, 2 years in the future, hybrid Zoom school, but working together. So that's kind of the last frontier, and the hope is that, I think, well, for myself, I don't want to speak for everyone, but it's important for me that it's not little islands under one roof, but that there's actually some sort of collaboration that's happening aesthetically and kind of like, yeah, like concessions maybe that they'll have to make, sort of working through it as a team. It's an experiment that hasn't been, at least while this is the 3rd time I'm teaching Form and it hasn't happened. So we'll see. So it's quite a big group, but yeah, I think it's, yes.
This is foundation, Jacob.
It's foundation. Oh, sorry. Did I say Form? Sorry. I always keep forgetting. Yeah. I also think, by the way, that like the thing that challenges, ultimately for me anyway, the thing that challenges the hegemon, like sort of like the radical political act in my head, at least for now, is not ultimately the like changing the representational technique. Because more and more I just think that like, yeah, like Hayduck et al. Were arguing for a radical political ideal with the isometric, and now it's the opposite, or not opposite, but it's moving back toward first person's perspective, is like we need to be more humanistic, blah, blah, blah. And I feel like that will continue changing, but the compelling thing politically is exactly that. It's like, okay, now you have to collaborate, removing individual authorship toward just thinking about what it means to work as a team. Like the aesthetic sensibility and the representational techniques are kind of incidental, in my head anyway. Maybe that's unpopular opinion, but
I can't imagine that they're incidental in this moment of coming undoneness. Like we are in a crisis. This world is in a crisis. It's incredible that we're even capable of having this conversation this evening without a total psychological meltdown in advance of tomorrow. But here we are. And I mean, it's the seduction of the image that's keeping us, you know, sane maybe, or like focused. Thank you for focusing into this 1 point perspective. But I do think the fact that you've set up the studio to ultimately be represented through a series of animations is worth us thinking about, because again, this is quite a radical idea. It's both setting up the subjectivity of the experiential body in this experiment, but it's suggesting that that body can be set in motion, and this is typically an unmeasured way of experiencing a foundational studio. Like it's difficult for us to capture the relationship of part to whole, or any other, you know, normative disciplinary ways that we think about foundation. So I wonder if we could take a moment and think about what animation does, which is so different from just you know, a perspective that we would be turning to maybe a couple of years back. So what is happening to us with the fact that this cinematographic experience is suddenly the delivery mechanism for subjectivity?
Who wants to take that one?
McLean, I mean, like, this is your bread and butter, no? What
You're the one
doing?
with the degree in semiotics. I'm making tater tots
I
now
know,
too,
but
while I'm listening to you.
And I'm kicking my dog, so he's quiet.
No, I don't have an answer to that question, but I do think I agree with you that representation is not incidental. I mean, it might be mercurial in our reading, or our values might be mercurial as we interrogate our means of representation, but I don't think they're incidental. I mean, I think maybe in 10 years, we'll be looking at this and we'll be thinking like, God, how could we have ever allowed students to like make these kinds of beautiful animations out of with software that is developed by such nefarious companies with, you know, terrible kind of political alliances. And maybe, you know, so maybe that would be the valence through which the prominent valence through which we would be like interrogating our representation. But I don't think it's, I think like all points still stand. I think like Anya, that the phrases you used, I think are really useful to hold on to. It's like, it's not, I don't think it's about like not ever using a axon because of all of those guys. And I don't think it's about not ever using a perspective because of an idea of idealized subjectivity. But I do think it's about interrogating the subjectivities that are implicated within these different ways of representing our work and viewing the work. So I'm not really sure like how to like bring that exactly to this work, but I think it would be like to try to be a little bit more clear. It would be fundamentally different if we had necks here and we could like move around and look at different parts of the project. I think that would be a really different subjectivity than the kind of panning, slow roll, going through the thing. It has there's a different understanding of agency, or stasis, like just stasis. Stasis would be a very different one. Like this, again, I think these are amazing, but like there is also a little bit, like another way to read it entirely, a little bit of like an IKEA showroom thing going on here, where it's like, you know, one set of I can't think of one set of like clap shelves or something like that next to the Billy thing over there, and you know, we're like moving through, and something about the speed and the tempo that does tend to consumerize everything also, in a way I'm not criticizing. I just think it's a really interesting quality of the work. Anyway, I don't think it's neutral. I don't think representation is ever neutral, and the way that you guys are working on these things are ever neutral.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but I think if we had necks, we would have to shoot something in this scene. Like we would be so close to a game, you know, like we would have to take some of those IKEA pillows and shoot them down.
But aren't we already really close?
Yeah, we're very close. But the fact that we continue to occupy this one perspective, this for me, it's like, it's so hard to give up the hegemony of architecture as an organizing premise in the way that we read space, because it's still total control. Like we cannot abdicate total control over the experience of the image and the representation, because then we would slide into some other discipline that we're not quite comfortable with due to its populism. So it's super fun. I mean, I am smitten with this exercise and the premise of its curatorial presentation. I just love it, and I'm also deeply troubled, and I'm, you know, like we're making sense of it live.
Yeah, I'm happy to be uncomfortable. I mean, that's like, it's comforting to have a core studio that's uncomfortable, because usually it's so expected.
Yeah. No, it's really fantastic. But yeah, would this work if you gave everyone a joystick? Do joysticks still exist?
I think they're called controllers.
Controllers.
There you go.
Are the students still there?
Is anybody
Yeah,
there?
I wish we could.
I suddenly think we might just be talking to ourselves. But...
There's 44. We have a captive audience of 44 people.
Okay.
By the way, incidental. I more mean fickle. I mean fickle. Like
fickle.
I think there's like I don't mean that they're unimportant or secondary, of course. I just mean that like it was more a side comment about the weight that is put on representational techniques that I've become suspicious of. Like I wonder how I think the weight that's put on them is more actually, it's undue, I guess. That's all I meant. And they change constantly with, you know, the wind. So this is more what I was talking about, which may also be unpopular, but I just wanted to be clear about my unpopular opinion.
No, I don't think that, I mean, I agree with that then. I don't know. I think that's something to keep, again, in a foundational studio to really keep in mind, like thinking back again to I don't know, Cooper and the education of an architect, like maybe it wasn't wrong. It's just that architecture is a cultural practice and we are in a very different place now. And so that submits that work to a radical reevaluation relative to our contemporary practice. I mean, this is what, right, this is what history is. It's not, I mean, I don't need to tell you guys this, but it's not like saying what happened. It's trying to understand the embedded cultural projects within a thing that are newly relevant now for different reasons. So yeah, I think I agree with you there, Jacob. It is fickle and it's mercurial and it's changing, and we have to know that like what we believe, like the architecture that we create now, that we think has a certain kind of cultural cachet or even like social agency, will be radically different 10 years from now or 15 years from now, or like with the pace of culture now, like next year.
Yeah, or the 15 minutes from, like, this is I think the weight of agency for the architect, I hope, doesn't lie in aesthetic sensibility. Otherwise, I feel like we're a bit troubling. It's slippery, I guess.
But then just to like argue with you again, like I think like in a foundational studio too, I think we have to like, I don't know, I think aesthetics are so important and politically pervasive. Like go now and turn on Fox News and then turn to MSNBC or PBS. And I mean, not to be reductive, but there you will see like how impactful aesthetics are, and that's only where it's most vivid. But you know, I would argue it's around us all the time, influencing our ideologies and our daily lives. And we as architects don't necessarily have complete control over that either. Definitely not. But it is, you know, something that we touch, and I don't think we should dismiss in its agency.
Mm-hmm.
We've entered the end. I think that we've got to the end of the internet. Is it what you guys thought it was going to be?
It's the internet wall.
This is
I never
right.
knew. This is the end. All right, Isham, make us like get really small and disappear.
And disappear. Now that we're at the end, do we need this?
We have an end, like a credit scene. So if you guys say it's over, then I'll just put that on.
Oh, I didn't know we had a credit scene.
Can the students tell us if this is what they expected tonight?
Can they enter this white world? Cloudiness.
Maybe they're leaving things in the Twitch chat.
They're leaving.
Yeah.
Bob.
They're leaving colorful hands. Bob Ross.
I liked this more than what I expected it to be.
That's good.
Thanks. Good.
Beauty of low expectations.
Yes.
Anya McLean, this was exactly what we were, at least what we were hoping for. I think that, you know, we need help from our colleagues to come in and make sense of all of this. And yeah, I think that there's many layers to unpack. I mean, I would just say, like, you know, like, it's always helpful for me. I am constantly like unlearning things that are deeply embedded in my mindset and mentality, how I was taught, and trying to both sort of like crack open, retain some positive aspects and put them into a new context, but also just like reframe things constantly. And it's a difficult job. And Jacob and Lina, I think, have been there. You know, I don't want to speak for them, but I think we're all trying to kind of shake things up without, you know, losing some of the strengths of this particular program in years past. But anyway, all that is to say, we needed help. You guys gave that help. I hope the students heard it that way, because it was, yeah, it was exactly what we were kind of hoping for. So thank you too for your efforts. We needed to give a very, very, very big thank you to Meg Clevenger, who compiled this crazy Rhino file.
Wow.
Thank you, Meg.
Bravo.
Yeah, thanks, Meg.
Yay.
And of course to the Wizard of Oz, Ishan, who's
Yes,
behind the
thank you,
scenes.
Sean, also.
So yeah.
I don't know how to whistle.
All right, where's this credit? Where are these credits, Ishan?
Oh.
Exteriors.
Oh,
Wait, what?
Oh, wow. Oh.
This
Oh
is a
my
surprise.
God, this is like
Wait, this is
turning into
review
something
part two.
Oh,
crazy.
now we have to have another review.
you guys, it's all been a sham. You brought the objects back.
Oh no!
In
What's
the
that
accents.
activity now?
Yes.
Which, what a revelation!
Take
No,
back
it's
all of that other things I said.
Yes,
It's just
that's
this
really
squiggly.
amazing.
That will never leave my mind. Aesthetic
It's really,
colonoscopy.
it's best crit ever.